I'm Michael McFall, the director of the Freeman Spokely Institute for International Studies. And we are here, I believe, for our 8th seminar series at FSI called COVID and, where each one of our research centers and programs takes a turn at exploring the implications of the pandemic for their particular areas of research. Today, we have Professor Frank Wallach and Mark Thurber from the Program on Energy and Sustainable Development at FSI. They'll be talking about COVID and the future of energy markets. Frank is the director of the program and senior fellow here at FSI, also a professor in the Department of Economics. And Mark is a research scholar and the program's associate director for research. Mark is also the author of a recent book, Coal, which I'm sure he'll be talking about today. And that is C-O-A-L, not C-O-L-E, the name of my son. Before I hand it over to Frank, I want to thank everybody who joined us today and throughout this series for the last 2 months. For the next couple of weeks, we're going to have a slightly different timing of the format to take advantage of a few special opportunities. And let me just advertise a few of those now. Next Wednesday at 1:30, 3 of our FSI colleagues and I will discuss a new white paper on the rise of global populism. The following week, on June 5th, we are co-sponsoring a webinar with Stanford Center on Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences as part of a series called Social Science for a World in Crisis. Professor Barry Weingast and Tino Cuellar, the former director of FSI, will be presenting that paper. And if that's not enough, the week after, on June 12th at 11:30, we'll be hosting former Secretary of Defense William Perry to talk about a new book that he has co-authored called The Button, The Nuclear Arms Race and Presidential Power from Truman to Trump. Not to mention all the other events that are happening at our centers and programs, please go to our website, fsi.stanford.edu, to see about those other events, as well as many publications from all of our centers and programs that we've been putting out over the last 2 months. And with that, let me now turn it over to Frank. Frank, take it away.
Thanks very much, Mike. Welcome, everyone. I just wanted to give a bit more background on the bio on Mark today before turning it over to Mark to present. As Mike said, Mark is the Associate Director at PES, and Mark's research focuses on oil, natural gas, coal, in addition to electricity markets, and he oversees our research on distributed solar energy and low-income populations. And as Mike mentioned, he has a book out on the coal is the single title. And the theme of the book is, of course, why it remains the backbone of electricity markets around the world, despite its serious environmental negatives, which I think is going to be a major theme and something he'll elaborate on quite a bit today. Mark holds a PhD from Stanford and a BSc from Princeton. And the last thing on a personal note I'd like to say is that Mark is an excellent writer and communicator, as I hope you'll see today. Whenever I write anything for PES, I give it to Mark to improve what we at PES now call to be Thurberized. So I'll turn it over to Mark right now and let him talk. And afterwards, I'll take your questions in the message segment of the box, where you can ask questions it's on the chat, and then we'll ask them to Mark. So Mark, without further ado, take it away.
Okay, well, thanks, Frank, and thanks, Mike. It's fun to be here, and it's fun sort of for this excuse to think a little more deeply for all of us in these different areas about what does COVID-19 mean for the area that we're focused on. Certainly one thing that I've learned in working on book projects is that they take a long time. And so one of the key things for book projects is not to get too caught up in trying to anticipate how current events will play out, because you'll always be wrong. But I think the way that I tend to approach books is thinking about, well, what are the structural underpinnings of how a certain market works or area works? And then it's interesting because you can look through that lens at how because of the structure, how a certain area will respond to current events. And of course, now we have the very extreme case of this global pandemic. So that's how I'd like to take folks through this. And so let me start with the slides here. And so the way that I'll sort of approach this is, first talking a little bit about what did energy markets look like, and in particular, what was the role of coal globally before this pandemic happened. Then I'll talk about, well, what are the impacts we've seen so far of the pandemic? And then think for the last part of the talk about, well, what does this mean going forward? And I think that, there's a lot of, one outcome of this so far has been that there's been quite significant environmental improvements because the economy is shut down in so many places, which we don't want to have happen. But it's useful for kind of thinking about, okay, well, can we get some of these improvements in ways that don't involve all this economic damage? So I'm going to start off. Let's see if I can move my slides. Hold on a moment. Okay, here we go. So I'll start off by just giving a snapshot of what was the role of coal, and more generally, what was our energy market looking like before COVID-19. So here are just two pie charts, which summarize, at least in share-wise, the role of coal in global energy, as well as other energy sources. So if we start with the one on the left, so that's world total primary energy. So this includes, energy for electricity, for industry, for transportation. So that's all the energy that the world used in 2018. And so you can see that the biggest share was oil. And that's because oil plays such an important role. It's, oil-based fuels essentially drive almost all transportation around the world. So that's why oil is such a big contributor. But coal is next on that primary energy. And if you look at the right-hand pie chart, this is just world electricity generation. So this is, everywhere where the electricity comes from. And it's there that coal is far and away the most significant supplier of energy at about 38%. And that's been stable for the last several years. It's stayed around there. Natural gas is next, and then hydro, nuclear, and then some renewables. So coal, and I think it's easy to think in California and easy to think in the US that we're already done with coal because we have all these cleaner alternatives. And indeed, in the US, coal is very much fading away. It's being outcompeted by natural gas and also increasingly renewables as well. And so coal is fading here, but in many parts of the world, it's still the mainstay for stationary energy. And this chart kind of shows the trend in coal consumption over time. And so you can see that in the last several decades, the most significant industrialization around the world, namely in China, has been on the back of coal-fired power and coal-fired industrial energy. So, from about 2000 and over the decade after that, just dramatic ramp up in China's coal production and coal use, and as their economy grew. But actually in most emerging economies, coal in the last several decades has been the fuel that people turn to power industrial growth and their electricity generation. So probably everyone knows coal has some problems. It's arguably the largest contributor to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So in these charts here, to kind of get an estimate, this is from the IPCC, their climate estimate was that 65% of human greenhouse gas emissions were CO2 from fossil fuels. And then if you look below, coal is about 44% of fossil fuel emissions of greenhouse gases. And so overall, you can estimate that coal is responsible for somewhere on the order of 29, 30% of total human greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a huge issue for climate. Also, more pressing even if you're living in a rapidly developing metropolis, is that coal is responsible for very significant air pollution. So these charts here, this was from the Health Effects Institute, just showing a kind of map across China of PM 2.5. So these are these 2.5 micron diameter and less particulates that are very connected to respiratory disease and mortality from that. And so you can see that there's a lot of air pollution from power plants, from the industrial sector, even a little bit in China and coal burning regions that people just burn coal in their houses for cooking and heating. So, premature deaths every year that are directly attributable to coal burning, at least hundreds of thousands. I'd say probably globally, this is on the order of 1 million premature deaths around the world from coal, from air pollution. On top of that, there are many local harms associated with coal. The miners themselves are most affected through black lung disease or accidents, but there are various other environmental damages locally that result from coal use. So on the one hand, coal is this driver of a lot of economic development, lifting people out of poverty in emerging economies. But on the other, it has these very big environmental negatives. So, given all these negatives, why is it so hard to dethrone King Coal? And this is what I talk about a lot in the book, which Frank and Mike were mentioning, that came out last year. Is going through all these factors. And so that's what I'll boil down a little bit in this talk and in the next few slides. What are the things that makes coal so durable? So I'll talk about sort of 4 logics for coal. So logic number 1, coal is cheap. Now I do put an asterisk here that you need to ignore the environmental externalities, the pollution, the climate. But if those are not priced in an energy market, coal is cheap as a fuel. So this chart, I've put the 3 main fossil fuels, oil, and in the dotted black, natural gas in the gray lines, and then coal in the black solid line below. And I've normalized them by energy content. So these are in dollars per million BTU, which is a unit of energy. And so it kind of makes this point that on an energy basis, coal historically is almost always cheapest. So, coal, these black lines at the bottom, they're always sort of, $5 per million BTU or below. Natural gas fluctuates a great deal, but let's say gas is usually between maybe 5 and 15. Maybe oil is usually between 7 and it got as high as $25 per million BTU. So really, this is a key attraction of coal. It's just cheap, and people have confidence that it will stay cheap over time and won't have these huge gyrations that you've seen in oil and gas price. Another big piece about the logic around why policymakers favorite coal is something in some sense, each of these logics is one of the book chapters in this book, is energy security logic. And in fact, this even in developed countries. So the birth of the International Energy Agency, after the oil shocks of the 70s, that was actually a very explicit policy at the time, was because people were worried about the insecurity of oil and the susceptibility to OPEC. There was a very deliberate move by certainly the US and Japan, but also other IEA countries, developed countries, to move anything you could away from oil. And so this included electricity generation, stationary power. So there was a push back then to deliberately move into coal for power instead of oil. Although oil, oil is much harder to replace in transportation. But anyway, as this chart kind of shows, this chart shows some of the main coal producers and consumers. And just a few observations, one is you can see, so these black bars are the coal production within a country. The gray bars are coal consumption. So you can see, first of all, China is far and away the biggest producer and consumer of coal. You can see a lot of major economies have a lot of coal. So US, China, India, some others. And you can also see that there's some countries that import a lot of coal. So particularly in East Asia, so Korea, Japan, Taiwan. But there also is a lot of coal available to be imported from the world market. So Australia and Indonesia are huge coal exporters. US is also a coal exporter. Theoretically, we would have the potential to be a much bigger coal exporter, although, who knows if that'll happen. But anyway, there's always been this sense that if you need coal on the world market, you can get it. And there will be plenty of sources of it, and it won't be that expensive. So the third logic is, I'll call this practicality logic, which is coal is, at least in some sense, easy. So if you look at, one thing that you kind of ask is, okay, well, we have good reason for not wanting to use as much coal because of all this environmental damage. But then the next question is, well, what replaces it? And it's a surprisingly challenging question. I'll get into a little bit more on this later. But all of the potential big competitors to coal have their own real challenges. And just on this slide, let me flag one in particular, which is natural gas. So in many ways, natural gas is the most direct competitor to coal. Certainly in the US it is. And that's one of the reasons why coal use has dropped so much in the US, is that natural gas is very cheap. So in the power sector, it's now cheaper to make electricity with natural gas. But in much of the US has a very well-developed natural gas transportation infrastructure. We've got a lot of pipelines. We have a ton of gas, more gas maybe than the industry would like from the shale gas revolution. So, we're a very mature gas market. But in places in the world where, even where there's a lot of gas, so there are sub-Saharan countries in Africa that have significant amounts of gas, Nigeria, Mozambique, Ghana, several others. But gas infrastructure is very difficult to build out. It's very expensive to build pipelines. Liquefied natural gas, if you want to ship across oceans, is very expensive. And so it just has this difficulty about kind of stringing a supply chain together that makes gas very hard. Natural gas is much harder to store than coal. Coal, you can just stack up your coal somewhere. I mean, it's a little harder than that, but in many ways, coal is much easier. I'm going to talk a little bit about the wind and solar piece later, because I think in the public discourse, there's sort of this idea that, well, wind and solar are now very cheap, so they can instantly replace coal. And so they are very cheap and getting cheaper, but there are challenges associated with intermittency, which is that the wind and sun are there when they're there and not when you tell them to be there. So we'll talk a little more about this. And then is livelihoods logic, which has a real political salience, because coal has traditionally supplied a lot of jobs in a lot of countries, and relatively high wage jobs. So coal mining, at least in sort of larger kind of official mines, is typically a relatively well-paying job. And if you consider all along the coal value chain in places like China and India, so coal mining, coal transportation via railroad, coal-fired power plants, coal-using industries like steel making and making aluminum and many others, coal arguably supplies millions of jobs each in China and India. And even in places where it supplies many fewer jobs, so in the US, current coal employment is I think it's now even dropped below 50,000. So it's a far cry from its peak long ago with hundreds of thousands of people working in coal. But even in the US, you could see the political salience in the last presidential election of coal jobs. So this is a big challenge too, that there's this attraction in a lot of countries to, we need to supply a lot of jobs, let's mine coal and let's use coal. Okay, so that's sort of a snapshot of, you know, what coal and what energy markets were looking like. Now let's talk a little bit about, you know, what has changed since January. So there have been actually some really good papers on this and preprints just in about the last week. There's one that had some Stanford co-authors. There's this paper from Zhu Liu in Tsinghua with a long list of co-authors to quantify what have been the effects of COVID-19. And CO2 emissions is actually a pretty good way to look at that, you know, because there are a lot of people now trying to measure CO2 emissions, and you can see, you know, how those have fallen as people have started to have burned fewer fossil fuels. So really, it's the response to COVID-19. It's the sort of the shutdowns, the shelter in place, and the impacts that those have had. So this chart from Zhu Liu's paper, it's comparing the sort of the first quarter of 2020, which for each of these charts is the solid line, to 2019. And so you can see, you know, just a couple ones that are interesting to look at. You know, China, you can see that big drop sort of, you know, after late January, you know, that a big drop relative to the 2019 same period. And then, you know, their emissions have gone back up as they've restarted pieces of their economy. So you see this impact in different times at different places, but ultimately, you know, it's hitting everywhere. So this was from a Washington Post article that was kind of summarizing data from this other paper from Le Carré, looking at carbon emissions effects of COVID-19. And so what you can see is there was this first big bump from China, where CO2 emissions were decreasing. You know, it looks like at its peak, maybe 7% countrywide. And then, you know, as China has started to restart, you've seen the COVID-19 impacts economically in all these other countries. So there's this first hump from China, and then this later hump from everywhere else. And the Le Carré paper breaks this out as well by sector. So this is where it's kind of interesting. You can break down which pieces of these were more from coal and which pieces of these are more from oil. So if you look at power and industry, and remember this first hump in each case is largely China, and then the second hump is when everyone else was catching up and shutting down their economies. So you can see, you know, big impacts in coal and in industry, power and industry. So those are largely from reduced coal use. And then transportation. So they have surface, you know, road and rail transport and aviation. So those are all oil-based fuels. And you can see, you know, just as probably, you know, is intuitive to everyone from seeing how this has affected, you know, all of you, huge drops in surface transport. So massive shock to oil markets, and arguably even more than to coal markets. So just, you know, this, maybe people have seen this Reuters photo floating around, but this is a kind of a good visual illustration of, you know, air quality. This has been a very positive impact. This is the India Gate in New Delhi. And so you can see pre and post lockdown, just, you know, how much better that's gotten. And, you know, overall, this has just been a huge, you know, so we've had these improvements in air quality, and we've had these major reductions in CO2 emissions. But of course, it's not sustainable because, you know, this was from everyone shutting down their economies. So now I'd like to just come back to this question of, okay, let's reevaluate these four logics for coal and think about which, if any of these, will be durably affected by the pandemic. So, you know, as we come out of this, will the world look the same as it did when we went in, or will there be some changes that persist? So let's start with this economic logic, with the idea that coal is a cheap fuel. So that's still true. And so I'm sort of extending the plot with some new data kind of up until the present moment, thanks to Ian Hardman from PESD for pulling this very at the last minute. So if you look at the coal on the bottom, so coal is still in general cheaper than everything else. The shaded gray region, so that's starting in 2020. So this is where you start to see the COVID-19 effects. So there are a couple interesting observations here. You know, one is that natural gas prices were already decreasing. And so this again is partly ties back to this bounty of natural gas in the US, sometimes more than than the industry has wanted, because you get all this associated gas that comes for free when you're producing the oil from shale. So there have been various factors, you know, so if you see this blue dotted line, which is the national balancing point gas price in the UK, you can see that was already dropping pre-COVID-19. But you know, in gas, like that's continued to drop post COVID-19. You know, coal has sort of gone down a little bit. So, you know, both gas and coal their prices have dropped in the first quarter of this year. But oil, you just see this crash. I mean, so oil is the one that's really seen the biggest impact. And in fact, people might have seen news stories. There's the West Texas Intermediate, which is this U.S. Oil price index, which is the solid gold line. And you know, there were even some things where it got so bad, and there were some kind of weird things happening with derivatives in the market that, you know, there was a period where the price of oil was negative, right? So essentially, you if you wanted to store oil, people would pay you to do it, and so that was kind of a transient thing. But so you can see, yes, so coal is still very cheap, but arguably, actually, in some ways, that through COVID-19, it's gotten a little bit less competitive with natural gas. So it, you know, COVID-19 hasn't exactly helped coal from a fuel price perspective. So that's one interesting thing. And then another dynamic that's really kind of being brought into relief by this is this is another acceleration of some trends that were already happening. So let me take a moment to explain this chart. This chart is from California, where we don't really have coal in general, although sometimes we get coal power from the rest of the West. But if you see, you know, California, so if you look at the x-axis, this is hour of the day, and then the y-axis here, it's the price of electricity. So you know, the price of electricity changes throughout the day. And so, well, what are some interesting things you see? Well, one is that during the daytime hours, you have lower prices, and this is largely because of California solar, right? So the more solar California puts on, the more the price will drop in the middle of the day. So this is kind of what people call the duck curve, because this part on the right is sort of the head of the duck. I guess this is the wing of the duck and the beak of the duck. But anyway, so you have this already dropping price in the middle of the day. That's already was a challenge for coal, the more that you have this happen, because what's happening now is you'll have a lot of periods during the day where it's only renewables running and generating your power. And so the way the coal financial model works for a power plant is coal power plants are actually pretty expensive to build, but you make that money back because they're fairly cheap to run. The coal is cheap and you just run all the time. But if you can't run coal all the time, it's no longer you can no longer get back those high fixed costs. And so what we see here is, if you look at this light blue curve on top, that was the one, the period right before California did the statewide shelter in place on March 19th. And so you can see, since then, we've been an average of $9 per megawatt hour lower in our electricity prices, which is a lot about just this collapse in demand because of the economic slowdown. But what this is doing is this is exacerbating a lot of the challenges to coal's business model that were already there because of cheap gas and high renewables are now being hit with this lower demand. So this is, so this is another thing where the economic logic, at least for coal-fired power, is even more under siege because of what's happening with the economy. Okay, so energy security logic. So I think the question here that's relevant is, does this huge economic impact that we've seen from the pandemic, does that exacerbate the long-term investment environment where coal was already seeing headwinds because of concerns about climate change? So, there's been increasing pressure for multilateral lenders and sources of finance like the World Bank to not support coal anymore. So certainly this is true from the Western-based kind of multilateral banks that they're more or less stopping financing coal mines, coal power. And so I guess the question is, well, will COVID-19, is that going to accelerate the squeeze on coal financing or do something else? And so it's hard to tell for sure, but if you look at what's happening this week or last week, it largely seems business as usual for other sources of finance for coal. So a couple sort of high profile things to flag. So there's a big coal mine being developed in Queensland in Australia, which is financed by an Indian company, Adani, and basically self-financed because it's hard to attract investment in coal. That, as far as we can tell, that's still going forward. I think that mine is supposed to be producing next year. So at least as of this point, it's still going ahead. And then China, just within the last few days, announced that they're helping develop this $4.2 billion huge coal-fired power project in Zimbabwe. And this is part of a larger pattern where China is now sort of the largest source of kind of project development of coal power around the world and also finance. So, I think this is up in the air, but it's not obvious that COVID-19 really further dries up this investment stream. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this logic as far as, is coal easy relative to alternatives, is that going to change? And so now I want to talk a little bit about the renewable comparison, because I think this is what people mostly still think of is, why do we need coal? We have renewables, and renewables are zero carbon. They don't pollute. So in many ways they're much better. So the key thing I would flag here is that we still haven't solved this basic problem of, how do you supply energy to countries that are trying to, say, double the size of their electricity grids? So if you look at California, you look at Europe, you look at the rich countries, energy use overall is flat or potentially even declining as we get more efficient. But the big question is, how do we power South Asia? How do we power Southeast Asia? How do we power Sub-Saharan Africa? And renewables are still a challenge in those places, even though they're moving very fast. So a couple examples from Africa. So Kenya now has about 15% wind and solar, and they're dealing with very significant kind of integration challenges because of dealing with this fluctuating wind and solar that you can't predict. I was in West Africa last year, and in Nigeria and Ghana, and it was very interesting because we were talking about power sector issues, and so one of the ministers at the Ministry of one of the directors at the Ministry of Energy in Ghana was saying that they're pushing very hard to put on as much wind and solar as they can, but they're really struggling with being able to integrate large amounts at this point. And so they're actually having to put the brakes on some of their PPAs and delay them. But perhaps one way we could look at this is the very unfortunate economic fallout from this crisis. I mean, arguably, it will mean a slowdown in how much new power is needed and how quickly. So already we were seeing before the pandemic that the capacity factors for coal-fired power plants were dropping, and presumably this will exacerbate that. And so, possibly an impact is that you won't need new power quite as soon, even though that's a very bad impact because we want developing countries to have more power as soon as they can. But that's an interesting question. Does that allow us to slow the new coal pipeline and work on renewables integration and other alternatives, gas, maybe nuclear, other things. And so finally, with looking at this livelihoods logic, this is, I think, a really interesting question, which boils down to, will economic stimulus be green, or will it rely on coal? And I think, again, in the US, economic stimulus will not rely on coal. But the big question is places like China, India, and other fast-growing economies around the world. Traditionally, in China, coal was the go-to for jump-starting economic growth. So that's what happened, after SARS in the early 2000s. This was sort of going with heavy industry, going with heavy coal-fired industry. It happened to a degree after the financial crisis in the late 2000s. So this is the big open-ended question, and it's extremely interesting. We should get the FSI China experts back quickly to talk about the National People's Congress, which is going on right now. So a very interesting development is that China is saying now that they're not going to have an official growth target for their next sort of 5-year plan. Traditionally they've had these very aggressive economic growth targets. So that's very interesting. I mean, will that enable more space to not just pump money into heavy industry? Is it trying to get leadership, more room to maneuver? Might that make the outcome a bit more green? But I think the thing that we do have to be aware of is that this is, employment is going to be a top priority almost everywhere as we recover from the pandemic. So just to conclude with the last two slides, so where do we end up? Well, I think we have two sort of countervailing trends, right? One is that in rich countries and in power sector applications, COVID-19 is actually could potentially hasten the decline of coal, because this lower demand is putting even more pressure on the business model of coal plants. In developing fast-growing countries in industrial applications instead of electricity generation, I think that's where the big worry is, that there's going to be such a focus on, and a very legitimate focus on employment, on job creation and recovery. And the question is, does this get poured right back into coal-based industrial growth? So I think that's, and this highlights again the need for I think R&D on coal alternatives, so that we're ready to offer better solutions to poorer countries. So I would just like to conclude, if I could make two policy recommendations. The first one is that as we think a lot about economic stimulus, that tends to be sort of a industrial policy mindset. But I think this is a crisis which really opens the door potentially for carbon pricing. And carbon pricing is the policy that almost universally among economists, people believe is crucial to dealing with climate change. And the convenient thing now is that government budgets have been very much depleted by taking on debt to deal with the pandemic, and to keep people whole, keep businesses whole. So it's arguably a perfect opportunity for carbon pricing, which could raise revenue in a way that at the same time also discourages people from doing heavy carbon intensive things and encourages them to do things that are better from a climate perspective. And then the last thing is I think that I would love to see part of any stimulus be vastly increased R&D investment in a whole range of alternatives to coal, including better integration of renewable energy, but also other supply sources. So anyway, thank you for letting me think a little bit about all these topics and share some thoughts with you. So I welcome questions from anybody. And let's see. So just logistically, Frank, do you want to take the questions? I see you're muted there, or I could look through and address some myself.
Oh, hey, okay, good. All right, the host has unmuted me. All right, so how about the first one? A political question is, one person asks, how would U.S. coal consumption policies change under a Trump or Biden administration?
Great question. So I will give the glib answer, which is precious little. um, and and so but great question. And so the reason why I'm like I think Trump is a great illustration of the politics around coal versus the fundamentals around coal. So Trump obviously made hay of this supposed, democratic war on coal, which never really existed. That certainly the Obama administration was, you know, trying to do more on sort of various other coal-related policies and air quality and water quality policies on coal and air toxics. But really, what's doing in coal in the U.S. is pure economics. That because of what I talked about, that coal power plants are very expensive to build and relatively cheap to run. But that means you've got to run them all the time. And so what's happened is that now that natural gas is really knocking coal out of the power mix, and also renewables are increasingly knocking coal out of the power mix in certain times of day. It's just coal can no longer compete in this country. And again, that goes, the natural gas piece goes back to this shale gas revolution. And so, coal is really on its way out in the US regardless. And I think Trump really had tried to play. I mean, it was very deceptive, arguably, but he made promises that were never realistic about bringing back coal. And I think much of what's happening now, of course, partly due to a lack of federal leadership, is that many of the policies on renewables and other energy policies are going forward at the state level. What I would say, I would love to see whoever the next president is. I certainly have my own strong opinions about who I hope that will be. But I would hope that broad-based research and development funding for energy technologies and for clean energy technologies would be a big part of that.
So consistent with that, Mark, you got a question.
What's that? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, consistent with that, one of the questions you had was that a number of companies produce fossil fuels have been pushing carbon capture and sequestration as a part of the solution. What are your thoughts in terms of R&D on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a worthwhile area of R&D. So, the idea of this, for people who don't know, is that you capture the CO2 either at the smokestack of a fossil fuel power plant, or there are more integrated ways of doing it in the process, and then you pump that CO2 underground where it stays, hopefully for thousands of years. The biggest problem with CCS for coal is, to me, it's the cost, because basically, the whole virtue of coal is that it's cheap. There's nothing really else about it. Well, there are some other convenience things about it, but you do coal because you want something to be cheap, and then you add CCS, which makes it much more expensive. And so I always think that there's going to be a bit of a challenge on that. I think maybe where CCS is actually more promising might be for natural gas in the long run rather than for coal. But I certainly think it's still worthy of R&D. I mean, I think that if you look at the scope of the climate challenge, we need all the help we can get, for sure.
Okay, so a political economy question. Your point about the United States maybe needing money and using carbon pricing as a way to raise it, what about China and India? Do you think they see that question the same way, have the same answer?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so, China has done, they've made some progress on carbon pricing. They've had these for a number of years now. They've had these 7 pilot programs with carbon pricing for either at the province level or city level, and they've now have sort of a nascent national program. It's a little hard to understand exactly how it works, but as far as I can tell, it has put some finite price on carbon in all these places, and I think it creates some motivation for them to start doing the monitoring of greenhouse gas emissions. So I think it's all to the good. I think it's a step in the right direction. It's a very good question that you raised, Frank, about revenue generation and whether China sees it as a potential way to generate revenue. I mean, I think if they're smart, maybe they would sort of look at that. I think China on both the India on both the air pollution regulation and greenhouse gases, I think they're quite some years still behind China. And I think from India's perspective, it's still a little bit more, the perception is that all the rich countries are trying to tell them what to do on climate and telling them, put a carbon price on, or and they're right. I mean, the rich countries are trying to tell them what to do, and I can see how that's can be irritating. But I think, yeah, I would be surprised if India yet would be really thinking about that for revenue.
So another question, try to sort of combine some questions, but in some sense, what impact do you think is there are a number of environmental policies, like for example in Europe, that will effectively, hopefully kill the global market, will potentially kill the global market for coal exports. I mean, do you see that having any effect, or do you think that eventually, I mean, it's cheap, it's all the things that you said it is. Are there things that the industrialized world can do with its policies to limit this, this sort of, if you like, spread of coal globally?
Sure. So, in one issue that certainly I know, Frank, that you and I have thought about a lot is U.S. exports of coal, right? So the U.S. actually sits, I mean, people say, oh, well, the U.S. could be the Saudi Arabia of coal, because we sit on actually the largest reserves globally, and we have very cheap coal in the Powder River Basin, in kind of the sort of Wyoming, Montana. So that's a really interesting question, right? Now that coal consumption in the U.S. has really collapsed and continues to go down, what will happen to all the coal that's under the ground in the U.S.? Will we export it, or will environmental policies, make that impossible? And and if we did export it, is that an environmental positive, or most people might think not, but there could be some arguments that, well, it's lower sulfur coal, and if we so Frank actually has sort of looked at some modeling of this, of basically if there are places in the rest of the world, say in Asia, where there are very few alternatives to coal, which basically means that their coal demand is sort of inelastic, then there's an argument that, well, if we ship coal from the US to those places, they're not going to use any more coal, but actually what it'll do is it'll raise coal price in the US, and so it'll make even less coal used here. So you could have some scenario where coal exports like actually decrease global emissions. I think that's very complicated argument. You have to figure out what your assumptions are. But I guess what I would say for now, like what's actually happening, is the U.S. still. So one thing I haven't really talked about is that there's thermal coal, which is a grade of coal that's used for generating electricity or industrial heat, and then there's also coking coal, which is coal that's used for making pig iron in steel making. So that's a specialized type of coal that has higher value to sell for. And so the U.S. is still, a decently large exporter a pretty large exporter of coking coal. I don't think that those markets are going to be ultimately as affected, maybe. But yeah, as to whether, so I guess one question is whether environmental policies can block exports. And I think to some degree they can. I think that resistance to new coal terminals in the U.S. Pacific Northwest is at least one factor that's stopped those from being built. I guess the other question is, can we stop other countries from getting and using coal and building coal power plants? And that's where I'm a lot more skeptical. I'm really not sure. Certainly at the margins, having the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, having all these lenders not lend for coal projects, I think at the margins that makes it harder to use coal. But at least so far, I feel like certainly China has been very willing to fill the void on financing and developing those projects. So I'm a little skeptical of how well it works for us to try to keep anyone from using coal. And that's why I think a lot of my interest is in how do we come up with alternatives, so we're not telling countries in South Asia or Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, no, don't do this, without giving them alternatives for what they should do. Sorry, that was kind of a roundabout.
No problem. So now we're going to count on your expertise in other energy areas, in that, as I'm sure you know, and as you mentioned in your talk, essentially the price of oil in the global price of oil has effectively cratered the U.S. Shale oil production, simply because we're the marginal producer, and Saudi Arabia and Russia are sort of coming in, and market share has gone up, less capital to the U.S. Shale industry. What's your assessment of how this is going to play out in terms of, say, U.S. natural gas and oil prices? Do we expect a quick recovery, or long lasting? If you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting, multifaceted question. And I have a friend who works in the U.S. oil industry, and has for many years. And he was saying in his 50 plus years in the industry, he's never seen anything close to the devastation he's seeing right now, kind of in the U.S. oil patch. Because these low prices are just killing, all these, large and small producers and the whole kind of industry ecosystem around oil. So they're kind of factors that go in both directions. So one of the things about shale oil and gas is that they're smaller, more modular developments. So, a traditional kind of big oil and gas, like let's say now I'm making some big deep water, oil rig, and I have to find the oil and then develop and then produce it. Was traditionally hundreds of millions of dollars just to go through that. And at any point, you might not find the oil, you might not develop the way you want it. So very high risk, but then very high reward, and you just kind of pump the oil for a long time. It's very low cost, the marginal cost is very low. Shale is different in that, the wells are sort of, and the well pads are much smaller. So you do a development, and moreover, the decay curve, so you may get oil and gas for 7 years, and then you just drill a new well, right? So you're drilling a lot more smaller wells. And one argument that people have made about that is it lets the U.S. oil industry be kind of like a swing producer. So when price goes up, the U.S. oil industry can just turn it on and, pump out a lot more oil. When price goes down, it can pull back like it's doing now, very dramatically. So that in some sense argues for the U.S. industry being able to recover quickly. I do think, unfortunately, like kind of global transportation based on oil, I think once the economy comes back, once there's a vaccine, I think that part is, will recover potentially relatively quickly. so there's some factors that suggest that recovery could be fast. But on the flip side, I think the biggest challenge for the US oil industry is exactly what my friend was talking about, that this is just wiping out, companies, this is wiping out jobs, and it's really wiping out expertise that, oil and gas industry has always been boom and bust. And it's always had a problem that in the bust, like if you lose a bunch, you tend to lose a lot of people who who have a lot of knowledge about how to find and produce oil. So I think that's sort of the biggest question to me for the U.S. oil industry is the human recovery, and especially given that a lot of younger generations these days aren't very interested in going into the oil industry. So I think that's the big wild card. I mean, I think from a technical perspective, there's no reason that the recovery can't be pretty fast, but I think it's sort of, have you lost a whole generation of people who know how to do oil? So Frank, are you there? I think you're muted. I talked too long, so Frank, you're still muted, I think.
Okay, great.
Okay.
All right, thanks. I couldn't get unmuted. So you got time for one last question, and this one is a sort of a fun one. Clean coal, an oxymoron or an achievable goal?
Yeah.
You got about 1 minute here, Mark.
I mean, yeah. Well, so there are a couple dimensions. It depends what you mean by clean coal. Air pollution wise, it's very possible with the proper kind of emissions controls, you can make coal relatively benign air pollution wise, but you have to spend the money, right? And so in many countries, that's not it's not happening. I mean, so India's government has really struggled to kind of enforce and mandate air pollution kind of controls on their power plants. So, but at least theoretically, I mean, if you look at a new coal power plant in Japan or even in China for that matter, I mean, it's relatively clean from an air pollution perspective. From a climate perspective, going back to my previous answer on carbon capture and storage, I'm just skeptical because it seems like when you're, I mean, I hope I'm wrong. It would be terrific if carbon capture and storage for coal, could long-term be cost effective, because that would sort of remove a lot of this whole big tension about the very good things about coal and the very bad things about coal. But it's just, I think it's more likely that CCS is going to come on gas. So I'm a little skeptical of the clean coal. Although what I would say is, I wish that rich countries focused a little bit more on if poorer countries are going to build coal, trying to find out ways that they can at least make the air pollution less, so that you don't have 1 million people dying around the world because of air quality. So yeah, I'd say on clean coal, I'm sort of mostly skeptical.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Mark, and thanks very much to the audience. We want to get you off on time since I know everyone else has probably Zoom calls they've got to get to. But thanks very much, and thank you for all your questions. And I apologize to everyone if I didn't get to ask Mark your question, but I'm sure he'd be happy to take your email questions. It's M. Thurber at Stanford. So sorry, Mark.
It's all good. Yeah. So yeah, thanks everybody. This was a lot of fun, and sorry I can't see your faces out there, but I enjoyed it.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay. Thanks.